Lately, and partly because of this unit, I've been asking myself, at what point during my schooling did I start to learn and think about racial, cultural, and ethnic difference, and the experiences of Indigenous people? I admittedly haven't given much thought to this until studying this unit, as I just kind of believed that my current values, beliefs, and views formed independently as I progressed through my schooling years. But that's now not certainly the case, having previously not considered the wider social influences and implications. I will be mainly speaking about my primary school and high school experiences because I consider these to be my formative years, and also because the latter is relevant to me as a secondary education university student and future practitioner. But let's take it back to the beginning. I was born in the mid-90s. I don't remember much of my preschooling years, except that I attended a preschool in Bass Hill, a western suburb. I spent my entire primary schooling years at a Catholic primary school in Bankstown, another western suburb I had lived in all my life. My family were and are still practicing Catholics, and so am I, but I'll speak about those influences later. I think a little introduction to my hometown is needed, as it'll be important to what I have to say. Understanding place is significant for sociologically minded teachers. Moreover, they should maintain the dominant culture's insensitivity to the socio-historical features of place, whilst being aware and respectful of ideas about cultural difference. This means that place or hometowns impact how students are viewed and how they view themselves. Historically, Bankstown was populated by working-class white Australians, but since the Vietnam War, many Vietnamese or boat people, as we call the refugees who came by boat, settled in Bankstown, including my parents. Then later, many Middle Eastern people, especially Lebanese people, settled in Bankstown as well, many also escaping conflicts. Since then, Bankstown has become increasingly multicultural, with Pacific Islander, African, Indian, and Chinese communities, to name a few. These days, it's a mostly quiet and peaceful town compared to the press it received during the tumultuous years after 9/11. It's no surprise then that most of my primary school classmates were from Vietnamese and Lebanese backgrounds. Many of us had similar family stories, mostly with parents who were refugees escaping conflicts. Thinking back about it now, the incredible thing is that we all thought it was normal, because to us that was the norm. I didn't even know I was disadvantaged, and that's because I didn't even learn that I was considered disadvantaged until I got to high school, where I've had so many teachers and students asking me about my family's history, like I was a case study for what we were learning in HSIE. It was a bizarre feeling, but this was also a time when there was a push from many social institutions for the hidden and null curriculums in education to be brought to life, meaning increased migrant voices and stories. There were very little white Australians in my school, and none in my class, making it incredibly difficult for me to adjust to the Catholic high school in Sydney CBD that I eventually attended. If I have to choose one theoretical tool that guided the primary schooling experiences of myself and many of my peers, it would be that of the myth of meritocracy. The idea that one could work hard and be successful was, understandably, extremely attractive to many older generation Vietnamese parents who were, in fact, sold a vision of a meritocratic nation that they were fleeing to. And for the most part, it was valid. However, this set a dangerous precedent for me in the beginning. It's all nice and hopeful to think that working hard will get us somewhere, which is of course true to a certain extent, but I had no idea that there was very well a point I could not go past or would experience incredible difficulty in doing so. I had no idea about the cultural hegemony in place, that although it seemed equal and magnanimous that ethnics could work hard and get into a field of their choosing, that their presence sometimes merely served to fill in the lowest rung of an organization, showing little prospect for growth. And perhaps just as dangerous was the mindset that if I didn't excel academically, I was doomed to failure in life. The idea that students' identities develop and change beyond or outside of formal education was beyond me due to the aforementioned dominant discourse. This illusory notion of failure is one of the hidden implications of subscribing to a meritocratic perspective, one that reflects societal issues and destroys rather than motivates lives. So, this was the social and cultural capital that I brought with me from primary school into high school, and even into my early university years. From my understanding, it's deeply grounded in a meritocratic view of society taught at school, particularly in history with ideas like the Lucky Country and the Anzac founding legend. These stories all convey the idea of a society built up on notions of a fair go and mateship, and I think the ideas themselves are certainly benevolent, but it's just that the reality is so different. This had to do with the normalization of cultures, because mainstream Australian culture and its values, as mentioned, effectively silenced or forcefully replaced many cultural values of the people who migrated or lived here. For example, a post-colonial analysis of the concept of a fair go suggests that it tends to be more concentrated on the future, as it completely discredits the troubled history of the indigenous peoples in Australia with frontier violence and dispossession. I didn't develop ideas about how deep cultural differences and indigenous issues were until my later years in high school, when finally subjects I studied, such as legal studies and studies of religion, began to really make clear links between historical and contemporary issues. Thinking back to my primary schooling, the extent of the education we received about Indigenous Australians was through an exploration of Dreamtime stories and a tiny bit of early Australian contact and settlement history. Of course, we were taught about the First Fleet in Botany Bay. I even remember a learning experience where a presenter came to the school to cook an example of food that convicts would have eaten, but nothing about Indigenous Australians. Now, this was all part of the mainstream enacted curriculum. The hidden curriculum here gave a version of Australian history that was overwhelmingly Eurocentric from the get-go, not bothering to cover any early European and Indigenous interactions, which I did not learn about until high school. Finally, the null curriculum for this example not taught was the bloody history of Australia and especially frontier violence against Indigenous peoples, something that I only got tidbits of knowledge through protests I saw in the media, but otherwise nothing officially taught at school. The students whose stories are left out are called the unseen half. Since many diverse students and families, often non-white Australians, are always affected by social policy but are not seen or catered to properly by the teachers. And to expose the flaws in mainstream enacted curriculum is therefore the responsibility of all teachers. Now that's why Kevin Rudd's sorry speech, or apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples, was so groundbreaking. To get an idea of how important it was nationally, the only other time I remember during school where we dropped everything to turn on the television was the National Melbourne Cup race. The apology really challenged the lack of Indigenous perspectives and narratives in school curriculums at the time. I remember being in Year 6 and the teachers having us all stop what we were doing so we could turn on the TV and watch the events unfold before our eyes. This was perhaps my first real brush with the hidden and null curriculum that wasn't taught to us beforehand. Now I'm just going to show a short part of the sorry speech just for the viewers who may or may not have seen this before.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
Now, even though films about Indigenous peoples, and especially the stolen generation like Philip Noyce's Rabbit-Proof Fence in 2002, actually predated the apology, it wasn't until after the apology that I remember being shown the film repeatedly. And if this doesn't show the relationship between social institutions such as politics and education, then I don't know what does. It also highlighted a relationship that I didn't know about between religion as a social institution and education, because after the apology there definitely became a clearer link between core Christian values of inclusion and community, and studies concentrating on the relationship between early Christians in Australia and Indigenous peoples, especially the role they had during the stolen generation, and efforts to make amendments since. But beyond core Australian ideals, the myth of meritocracy is also grounded in an entire generation of poor and struggling Vietnamese refugees and their vision of hope, perhaps a bit too hopeful and forceful in applying it sometimes. But that I can totally sympathize with, having grown up with it culturally. I guess coming into a new country where values were already present, meritocracy was the easiest of all the values to sell to the desperate and hungry newcomers. Understanding the cultural capital that certain students bring with them into a schooling environment, such as students who experience pressure to study excessively, and their families who are pressuring them to do so, helps me as a future teacher to be more empathetic and understand where students and their families are coming from. Using the sociological imagination and deficit theory here helps me to understand that no, it's not a problem with the student or the parents pressuring the students in a harmful manner, potentially, but it's a problem with a society that sells the idea of limitless freedom through labor. And this is dangerous because it doesn't make any room for the privileges in place that many people are actually able to experience but others don't even know about. And the role of the teacher here is to be the bridge connecting the two realities to help bring about truth. One of the ways this can be done is by encouraging parents' participations in the children's education. And this can be done not only through the traditional academic process, but through extracurricular schooling activities such as music and sport. Going to high school and entering a new cultural environment was a huge shock for me. Unlike in primary school where everyone was from similar backgrounds, I began to be often asked by other students, sometimes even teachers, where I was from. And even the question, where are you really from? As if being born here still did not qualify for me being Australian. Fortunately, this only occurred during my junior years in high school. I think through changes in world events, improvements in education and curriculum, or even just becoming friends with students from different backgrounds, really diverse backgrounds, a more inclusive idea began to develop. But going back to the beginning and using a critical race theory approach, it was clear to me that the idea of Australianness, or at least appearance-wise, was still associated with whiteness. Since this was the norm against other cultures were to be decided regardless of their citizenship or birth status. Critical race theory is a useful sociological tool as the focus on race reminds us of the history of ethnic and racial institutionalized discrimination. This is especially the case for examining how indigenous and migrant students were treated over periods of time. This normalized discourse of whiteness was, in hindsight, probably introduced to my peers through their families and institutions such as the media and, understandably, their primary schools if they attended one which didn't have multicultural classes. Back then the mainstream enacted curriculum was still far more Eurocentric than it is now. That said, after considering dominant discourses and thinking about critical race theory together with other sociological tools, I think that one of the contemporary issues to continually look out for in schooling is the nature of the curriculum. This is a problem that can never truly be resolved due to its inevitable connection to the politics of the time. But fortunately, it's something that teachers can transmute into a more appropriate and thoughtful form to students. Now remembering what was and wasn't taught during my time in primary and high school, the challenge for me is to think more widely when teaching content and skills to a diverse group of students. Some questions to ask myself is, how is this likely to influence students' thinking outside of the subject as citizens? Does it help them to be more informed and active citizens? Is this information likely to change in the future or be subject to scrutiny? Well, more than anything, I've come out of this autoethnography with an understanding of how dynamic all knowledge is and how inextricably linked it is with social institutions. And this doesn't mean that teachers have to always be playing catch-up, however. Being armed with sociological theories can really help us think things through a bit more clearly and consequently become not necessarily more effective educators, but more empathetic and reflective educators. And this is the list of references for some of the literature I have referenced and used or quoted throughout this autoethnography. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my personal story.